Shamanism and the Sacred Landscape, presented by Chris Trwoga. In this lecture, Chris looks at ancestor worship, chambered tombs, stone circles, alignments, and how they mark the line between world and spirit, mainly studying Avebury, Dartmoor and Kilmartin Glen. Recorded live at Megalithomania Conference 2006.
We live in a scientific age. That sounds like a rather banal and obvious statement, but I think we actually need to think back and consider what the impact is of living in a scientific age in the way that we think about our entire world and indeed our entire experiences. Before I launch into my attack on the scientific method, I think I should say that I am also appreciative of what science has delivered. Scientists arguably are the shamans of our age. They are the ones who have performed all the great tricks that would have dazzled us 1,000 years ago. When it comes to archaeology, I was astonished, for instance, when I read in 2002, when they discovered the so-called Amesbury Archer near Stonehenge, that not only could they carbon date those remains, but they were able to take unbelievably microscopic samples from the tooth and check the oxygen isotopes, and not only tell us how old those remains were, but indeed tell us where that man has been. Tell us he had once lived in a mountainous area of Central Europe and had migrated to the region where Stonehenge was built. But science has also delivered many other things. In the last century, it delivered the greatest shamanic trick of all, the nuclear bomb, and delivered to the human race the means by which we might destroy ourselves. And from this scientific worldview, I feel that we need, certainly within our own field, to take a little bit of a step back. What got me concerned about whether, in fact, the scientific method, the use of astronomical instruments, theodolites, computers, and all the rest of it, instruments to test the acoustics of tombs, instruments to test the acoustics of Stonehenge, what made me think that maybe we were perhaps straying away from the point was when I reread Stonehenge Decoded. And in a rather sort of significant passage in which the work was describing the positioning of the Aubrey holes and how by repositioning stones in them you would in fact have a wonderful sort of computer for predicting the phases of the moon and the various positions of the moon, that we ended up describing something that was built 4,000 years ago as a computer. And in fact, what we had done, or what we are doing, I feel, is remaking our ancestors in the image and likeness of ourselves. My central contention, in a sense, is that they were not scientists. And when they built those megaliths, they were not there on the ground worrying that much about the solar and the lunar alignments and getting it right. They were responding to something far more primal, far deeper. And I believe that this thing that they were responding to is something that we, in a scientific age, are in danger of losing. If any of you are artists or students of art, at a first glance, you might think this picture is a very famous painting by Mantegna of the dead Christ. And when Rembrandt painted this painting, he had Mantegna's dead Christ in mind. The original is a painting of a God who came down to earth and became man, who lived his life and sacrificed himself for the sake of mankind. In death, it is still human. In death, it is still noble. In death, it is a symbol of suffering mankind. This is science. When we look closely, we notice that the stomach, the intestines, the cavity is empty. The gentleman at the back is busy moving the brains. This is an anatomy lesson. Rembrandt is saying something very different about what science is saying about humanity. And I like to think of this almost as an image of our megaliths. We can anatomize the human form. We can take the corpse, we can take out the brains, we can take out the intestines, we can take out the heart, we can tear the whole thing to bits. And yet somehow in all of that, I believe we will have missed the point of what it was all about. And so it is, I feel, with the scientific method and the megaliths. In a sense, in adopting the philosophy, the values, and the beliefs of science, and indeed we are part of the scientific age and it's hard to unravel that, maybe we are losing sight of something much richer and much deeper. A long time ago, I read a book by a man called Rudolf Otto. The book was called The Idea of the Holy. And what Rudolf Otto was trying to do in that particular work was to make sense of what it was that had stimulated human beings in all of these different contexts to do amazing, unbelievable, and impossible things in the cause of some kind of a raw emotion. If, for instance, we take the Giza Plateau and the pyramids of Giza, now maybe we can look at them as some way by which the Pharaoh asserted control over Egypt. We may look at it as an exercise in massive egotism. We may apply all of our scientific instruments and work out the different alignments, the celestial alignments, the alignments with Orion, and all of the rest of it. But I feel that in a sense we are missing the point. The phrase that Otto uses is the numinous. That certain pre-rational response. This isn't a scientific response. This is an innate response to that which is holy. He talks about the mysterium tremendum, that strange, overwhelming feeling, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, that maybe when we go to our sacred sites, we put aside our scientific instruments. We put aside our interest in getting everything absolutely right, in understanding how the different stones are related to each other and working out the different alignments with the landscape. And instead, we allow that which is innate to all humanity to come to the fore. Our sense of awe, our sense of dread, our sense of wonder, our sense that there is something in this landscape which is deeper and more powerful and more meaningful than anything that the scientists can come up with. This is the idea of the holy, the idea that we all have another way of reading and seeing the world. And my fear is, having worked with children now, in fact it's for 30 years, is that what science is doing to our world is actually deadening that response, deadening our innate sensibilities to the divine and to the holy. And indeed, over time, as Gareth mentioned, I have carried out experiments with our youth to see if, in fact, I can awaken something of that raw response. And we have been to Orkney. If any of you know Orkney well, there are two particularly fine, well-preserved tombs, one on Queen Hill, one on Widdiford Hill. And when you go into these tombs, you have to go through very dark, very narrow, constricting passages. When I've been in there myself, it's taken all of my sort of strength, if you like, to get round the various narrow bends and get into these tiny chambers. And then you find yourself in the darkness. You find yourself in the silence. And as is often the case with these tombs, there's this strange evenness of temperature. And what you start to experience is that which society, the removal of that which society as it stands has done to us. Sensory overload, the battering of the senses. The senses are freed. And in that kind of area, in that kind of experience, something else starts to emerge. To use the old Christian phrase, it's the still, small voice. How do we express that holy other, that sense of the numinous, that sense of this presence? By the very nature of what Otto said and what I believe, that it's a pre-rational response, we want to put it into words. We want to try and make sense of the experience. But invariably, I believe, because it's an innate response, words tend to fail. In our great religious traditions, whichever one you choose, it is in ritual, it is in song, it is in poetry that we try and manifest, if you like, to evoke, to share the mysterium tremendum. And what is central to my argument, we try to evoke it in the building of great megaliths. To quote Rudolf Otto, the motive underlying the erection of these gigantic blocks of stone, hewn or unworked, single monoliths or titanic rings of stone, as at Stonehenge, may have well been originally to localize and preserve, and as it were, to store up the numen in solid presence by magic. The numinous throbbing in the soul, almost like a mechanical reflex, must themselves have been conscious of this effect and intended it. My book actually spends some time going into Jungian psychology, and the length of the talk does not permit me to develop this too much further. But when I've discussed my ideas with people, they've often said, well, hang on a minute, what is it? What is this world that you are contacting? What is it that you are reaching out towards? And I quite like the Jungian idea that we do live in two worlds. We have the conscious world, which dominates, predominates, has given us the scientific method. We also have our subconscious sensibilities, which speak through our dreams, speak through our imaginations. Central to my argument is that our remote ancestors did not regard our imaginations as something that was unreal or a fantasy. They did not regard dreams as unreal or a fantasy. They did not regard ghosts and spirits as unreal or a fantasy. The world in which they live, and this is what we have lost sight of, was a world where everything was animated, where everything had a spirit, where the stones, the rivers, the trees, humans, animals, everything had this dual nature. This is the essence of their worldview. And stones are not rocks chosen at random and set up. They themselves, in the view of our remote ancestors, were living things, things with spirit, things with life. And that is what we have to take in and absorb in order to see our megaliths as our remote ancestors did. What I'm working towards is, we'll get rid of the corpse, a shamanic view of the world. Start to see as they see the world. Now, I know this is a popular bandwagon, and quite a lot of people say, well, it's just one theory amongst many. But as my book develops the argument, the shamanic worldview is universal to indigenous cultures. Wherever we go, where indigenous cultures survive, shamanism is the worldview. And through ancestral spirits, through the spirits of animals, through the spirits of stones, the spirits within plants, this is how we move through the world and make ourselves safe within the world. It is a universal worldview. What I have to demonstrate today is that that same worldview which is present in indigenous cultures today was present in our own landscape 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. This is a drawing of a standing stone in Kilmartin, Glen. As you can see, it is a carved stone. Kilmartin, Glen, and thank you for asking, because I normally like to spell these things out. It is in the west of Scotland, the northwest of Scotland. And since you've asked, I'll also say that the main reason, in fact, why I've themed on Kilmartin, Glen, is because I feel it's a neglected landscape. We here in the south actually don't know much about it. And as you'll see at the end, the major bulk of my presentation will be about an interpretation of Kilmartin, Glen. These are called, as I'm sure you're aware, cup and ring marks. And it is so universal a symbol in Western Europe that I like to see it almost like the cross is to Christianity, or the crescent and the star is to Islam. It is the universal religious symbol of the megalithic era, the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. But what does it mean? Here's another example which shows a series of concentric circles. This, in fact, is on living rock. We find them mainly on living rock, where the rock emerges out of the ground. And this begins to introduce one of the fundamental ideas of shamanism, that of liminality. Liminality meaning a place, a point, a nexus within the landscape that we occupy, where the other world is close. This is what living rock, the earth, if you like, the bones of the earth coming out of the surface, means to many indigenous cultures. And you've only got to go to Australia and the Aboriginal cultures in Australia and look at their regard for rocks to see that this is in fact the case. But we've still got to interpret these particular symbols. And in Spain, I think we begin to see something of the answer. In a sense, what we are looking at is a kind of tunnel, a kind of pathway that penetrates, pierces the rock. And what we see in this particular illustration, a little bit of representational rock art, is animals actually entering and leaving through these tunnels, these pathways into the rock. And there are other examples from around the world that show very, very similar things. Now we have to think about how to relate this particular central symbol with the architecture of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. If you fly over a church, you will see that the church is in the shape of a cross. The church is in the shape of the universal Christian symbol. If you fly over a passage grave, or rather if you look at the plan of a passage grave, you look at the plan of a henge, what you see is a clear similarity between the architecture of the Bronze Age and the Neolithic and the fundamental basic design of the cup and ring mark. It remains, is the great single universal symbol of that particular period of time. Newgrange. If you look at a plan of Newgrange, what you see is a broadly circular design. Perhaps it's sort of somewhat more kidney-shaped. There is a long passage, 90 foot long or thereabouts, leading into the heart of the tomb, leading into a central chamber. This is the architecture of the cup and ring. And what some commentators have pointed out is that on passage graves, you actually rarely see the cup and ring symbol drawn or carved. This is because you don't need it anymore. The cup and ring is the symbolic manifestation of penetration to the other world. Here is the reality. Here is the nexus. Here is the point in the landscape at which the worlds meet. The entrance to Newgrange, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this particular picture. What I find absolutely fascinating about the whole experience of going into Newgrange is that it is a journey. Anyone who's been down that passage, and I've been fortunate to go down it 3 times, will experience it as a journey. It is a journey from light to dark. As some of you may know, the passage of Newgrange is on a slope. When you are close to the entrance, a lot of light comes through the entrance. As you go up the slope, that light becomes increasingly restricted until at the heart of the tomb there is darkness, there is silence, and you are in the court of the ancestors. As you can see, there are 3 chambers, small chambers, off the central chamber. And when you walk into that central space, you are not, if you like, in front of or behind. They are all around you. And the concept of communicating with the ancestors, of a relationship with the ancestors, is fundamental to shamanism. It is the heart of shamanism. That we don't just live in this moment, we don't just have these short, miserable lives. That we are not on a linear path through life. As the symbol of the circle dictates, life is circular. We are one with our ancestors. We will return to our ancestors and we will re-emerge with new life from our ancestors. That link, that bond is never broken. And of course, what you find in Neolithic tombs, not complete bodies, this is what some people struggle to understand. What you find are the bones, bone fragments, incomplete remains. And why is this? Well, again, if you look at shamanic belief, what the bones are the seeds. The bones are the seeds of new life. And so that we can be freed, so that our soul can move forward, can be released from this cage of flesh and move on to its next life, first, the bones must be rid of flesh. And in some shamanic cultures, they are very, very careful when they have killed an animal not to damage the bones, not to break the bones, to try and keep the skeleton intact, so it can be returned to the earth for the renewal of life. The bones, therefore, are the seeds of future generations. This is the famous triple spiral from Newgrange. And researchers such as Jeremy Dronfield have also put a different interpretation on how we might interpret them. I'm a little bit hesitant here because I am, as you've probably gathered, resistant somewhat of the scientific method and resistant somewhat of scientific research. But what Jeremy Dronfield and other commentators have focused on is the way in which both the monument and indeed these spirals may represent or symbolize altered states of consciousness, the so-called tunnels or vortices that people experience when they are dying. And what I found absolutely fascinating when I was reading his work and the work of other people is that when we are dying, if you like, when our hearts give up, should I fall down now and start having my heart attack, that a common experience is this, not only this state of ecstasy, people who have gone through this experience describe not misery, not pain, but a kind of ecstasy, and being pulled down this tunnel of light towards some beautiful destination. This is an extremely common experience, particularly in the modern world where people are being revived and are able to talk about this particular experience. And his argument and the argument of others is that the spiral, the multiple ringed cup and ring mark, is a symbol of that tunnel of light, that journey, that experience. There's also, again, in his work and the work of others, the interpretation of so-called navicular markings, which are common to a number of sites in Britain. I'm thinking particularly of, I'll promote his book, David Lewis Williams' Cosmos in Stone. The advantage of his particular work, because I wish to defend my argument, his work is based in South Africa. And the South African researchers have the advantage that there is living memory. There is a record of people who did these carvings and what it meant to them. And indeed, what the research has revealed is that there is a correct shamanic interpretation. This is a navicular carving at Knowth. Knowth, in case you don't know, is the great burial mound that's about 1.5 kilometres away from Newgrange. It's part of the great Neolithic cemetery at the Bend in the Boyne. And in South Africa, we have examples of where that navicular response, that navicular appearance, I should say it's, and I'm sure you may have heard this yesterday, an entoptic phenomenon. It's something, if you like, that our brains produce under certain states, is here being fleshed out and interpreted. And again, this is a key to my argument. I said at the very beginning that the shamanic response, the religious response, the numinous, is a pre-rational one. It doesn't actually make sense to our rational brains. It's something that overcomes us, overpowers us, reduces us to tears. We don't know why it's happening. We can't necessarily make sense of it. It's just there. But what the shaman's role is to try and make sense of those experiences, to give shape to them, to interpret those raw emotional responses for his audience. And that is where, in fact, shamanic landscapes start to appear in my argument. We live in landscapes. We move through a landscape. If you like, when we talk about our journeys, we see ourselves at certain places in the world. If we were a Neolithic society, we would also know those liminal places. We don't go there because there is something strange happening there. This is where we go to speak to the ancestors. This is the liminal space. And they would see the world not just as a physical environment, but as an environment which is spiritualized too. What the shaman needs is a means of interpreting these raw emotional experiences for his people. And very often we find what they do is to translate those experiences into a real physical landscape. They have to tune in, if you like, bed in with the landscape, and they can talk about their specific shamanic experiences relative to a world that their people would understand. And one of the arguments that I present in my book, that part of our own mental ill health, if you like, the disease of modern Western society, is that we are now divorced from our landscape. We buy it and sell it as if it belongs to us, which it doesn't. We rape the landscape for short-term material greed, something which is anathema to indigenous cultures. It doesn't matter. We also move from place to place as suits our careers and suits our needs, and every time we become dislocated. We don't belong. Part of the shamanic vision is to belong, to be rooted in the landscape. It is where our ancestors' bones lie. It is where we have had our root for countless generations. And I'm sure many years ago when it was a teacher who lived in the Mendips, discovered that he had genetic traces within his makeup that were the same as those of human bones found in the caves in the Mendips. And therefore that he was still linked intimately, physically, with someone who had lived in the Mendips 10,000 years ago. That must have been one of the highlights of his life. To feel, to know that we belong. Just a couple more examples that are often shown, in this case from Gavrini, to express this sort of idea that it is this kind of raw, emotional, bizarre, if you like, pre-rational experience that our ancestors were trying to communicate in stone. Here, both a sense of movement into a space and a sense of visual chaos. Because, of course, part of the shamanic method is to enter into an altered state of consciousness, and if you like, to do what it takes indeed to get there. I like this one particularly because if you stare at it long enough, it actually starts to sort of do peculiar things to your eyes. I just wonder what state the guy was in when he was carving it. And of course, a lot of people who talk about what our shamans were doing, no doubt, in order to go to that other place, and I've no particular problem with this, they would have been using substances to help them along the way. But of course, again, that's a feature of indigenous cultures around the world too. And once again, just another example. Here you have a passage grave at Loch Rue. If you go to New Grange, it is very, very worthwhile taking a little trip to Loch Rue. It's not far away. And there is a hillside which you'll usually have to yourself, or certainly that was the case when I was there a few years ago, where there are dozens of beautiful megalithic tombs. The only problem you may have, there's a guy, and this was the case anyway a few years ago, again things might have changed, who has the key. You have to find him to get the key, and then you can let yourself into these tombs, and yes, you can have the darkness, and you can have the silence. And just to the left, of course, you can see one of these carved stones with all of these intense spiral carvings. Sorry? Closing them? Oh, right, yeah. So you've been there fairly recently. 5 minutes. Finally, and I didn't realize I'd spoken for so long, it brings me to Kilmartin Glen, one of my favorite sacred landscapes. It is a natural landscape. The reason why it's so flat is because several thousand years ago, the glaciers made it that way. It is also the home of a huge range of monuments. What I want to quickly stress is the unity of Kilmartin Glen. Because what it has running down, if you can just about see in these pictures, first it's a linear cemetery. It is a cemetery of cairns, of burial places for the ancestors that are placed along the valley bottom. In order to get this kind of unity, this sort of liminal experience, the oldest monument there, the Netherlargy cairn, was in fact itself made into a cairn to resemble the cairns that were built in the later Bronze Age. The valley has around it several routes in, and each of those routes is clearly marked and defined, either with cup and ring stones or indeed with standing stones. Here's just another of the cairns that, if you like, march down this incredibly flat valley floor. And here are the cup and ring marks. There are 640 Neolithic or Bronze Age monuments, most of them small and insignificant in this landscape. And this makes me think about the state of mind, the sort of spiritual state, if you like, of the people who did this. There are often hundreds of cup and ring marks on stones. This isn't producing, if you like, a work of art. This is an icon-making process, where you do what has been done for countless generations, you do it in the same repetitive way in order to take you to that other place. And there's the association. The piece of land in front of this stone, when it gets wet, fills with water. There is a sacred pool, if you like, that appears at certain times of year. This is one of the ways in. This is the way to the sea. And of course, what we should bear in mind that this shamanic tradition is a tradition of the western Atlantic seaboard. Most of these monuments are close to the sea. This tradition, this belief, this culture passed by boat from country to country. And guarding this particular entrance, if you like, defining the sacred space into which people enter, is this cup and ring decorated stones. There are in fact two of them at Ormaig. When you see it, there's a huge towering cliff above it. It is on a platform which gives you a view to the sea. Very sadly, if you go there now, you will not see this view. A plantation has been planted there, and in fact you have to fight your way through a fir forest to locate it. So, unfortunately, that's an experience we can't have at this moment. And then, of course, we have monuments that have been sacred through time. Monuments that have manifested the presence of the ancestors since time immemorial. This is Temple Wood, also at Kilmartin, Glen, where we start off with a Neolithic, we have a stone circle, a kist is built into that stone circle, it changes shape. It is always sacred. It is sacred not for 100 years, but for 2,000 years. And this is another one of those circles at Kilmartin, Glen. The beauty of it, and I'm trying to encourage you to visit it, is that there is an ancient coach road which enables you to walk from one monument to the other without having to use the car. It is literally a shamanic journey. And if you go there, do it in the morning, 8, 9 o'clock, you'll have it to yourself, and as the mists are rising off the valley, it is an absolutely magical experience. You also have wonderful stone alignments. Now, there are so many of them that people who've written about Kilmartin, Glen, don't themselves fully understand what those alignments mean. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe for me, if you like, I see them as gun sights on eternity. To stand before them, yes, and watch the moonrise, and feel that sense of being drawn along the axis, the shamanic axis that links one world with the next. Coming to the close of my talk, I began by being critical, or fearful rather than critical, of the scientific method. Fearful that somehow something in us is dying when we turn to science to understand things of the soul, things of the spirit. We have something in us which needs to be reawakened. And we can leave our theodolites at home, we can leave all our measuring instruments, we can put our telescopes away and make the journey that really matters. The journey that is inwards into our own souls and our own subconscious, and the journey outwards through our imaginations that enables us in flesh and spirit to journey to the stars. Thank you.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.